Welcome, everybody. I welcome you to History Author Talks, and tonight we have another terrific episode. I am very pleased also to announce that if you go to historyauthortalks.com, you'll see the rest of the October lineup. We have some other exciting authors this month, and we have something a little special. One of the episodes that we're going to be doing is about fiction in history, so take a special look at that. That's a little bit different from what we've normally been doing, but I think it's going to be a really terrific show with David O. Stewart and a few other terrific authors. So I urge you to go to historyauthortalks.com and take a look at our upcoming shows. This evening, we are very pleased to have with us as our guest host, Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum. And without further ado, I'd like to now turn it over to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I appreciate this opportunity. Real quick, for those of you that don't know about the Fort Plain Museum, we're a tiny little museum in upstate New York in the Mohawk River Valley. We're probably about an hour west of Albany. The museum's been in business since the early 1960s with the hopes of rebuilding the fort like what you see in Fort William Henry and Lake George. So long story short, we still don't have the fort, but we have a nice museum. We have a lot of nice programs. Starting next year in 2021, we have 2 conferences. We're bringing back our Revolutionary War conference that was on the 1-year hold this year. And then we're also starting a new conference on everything prior to the Revolution. We're calling it Sir William Johnson Empire of Wars. Roger will be sending out links to our website with all that information. And as well, we have our bookstore as well online, which Roger will also send out information on that as well, the links. For all the authors tonight that are talking, we have their books plus many others. So without further ado, we'll get started here. The war begins.
Brian, if I could just interrupt, sorry, I forgot to mention to everybody, if you have questions for our authors tonight, I want you to use the chat feature. Though that chat feature comes directly to me, and I will be forwarding the questions to Brian, and after each of our authors do their presentations, we will have a question and answer period. So I urge you to use the chat feature to send your questions, and we will certainly forward those on and for the question and answer period. So, okay, Brian, back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roger. And so we'll get started. The war begins. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Quebec, 1775. We have 2 great authors tonight that are going to give a couple good talks. So I'll first introduce Glenn F.Williams. He is a retired Army officer who entered public history as a second career. He is currently a senior historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., where his previous positions included historian of the National Museum of the Army Project and historian of the Army Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commemoration. He has also served as historian of the American Battlefield Protection Program of the National Park Service, curator historian of the USS Constellation Museum, and assistant curator of the Baltimore Civil War Museum, President Street Station. He is the author of several books, including The Year of the Hangman, George Washington's campaign against the Iroquois, and he is also author of Dunmore's War, The Last Conflict of America's Colonial Era. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Glenn.
Thank you, Brian. I thought before I got into the actual start of the war, I'd like to talk about what led up to it, because, you know, we know a lot of myths and folklore about the coming of the revolution or Revolutionary War. It's one of my pet peeves. You know, there's a difference between the American Revolution and the war. American Revolution basically starts in 1765 and ends with the introduction of the Constitution in 1787, whereas the Revolutionary War, of course, is from the first exchange of musketry in April 1775 until the British evacuation of New York in 1783. I think it's a misconception among a lot. In fact, at your conference last summer, one of the other speakers says, well, it was all about tea. Oh, no, it wasn't about tea. And no, it wasn't all about taxes, although taxes played into it somewhat. Americans were used to paying taxes. They paid taxes to their county, to their parish, to their colony, to the king. What the rub was, starting especially in 1765, is that the colonies were set up, most of them, to mirror the mother country, with a lower house, a legislature, usually called the House of Representatives or something similar. In Virginia, it was the House of Burgesses, and a colonial council, an upper house, and then the royal governor sat in the place of the king's viceroy, and it was the job of the lower house to pass tax bills, just like in Congress. It is the House of Representatives. Just like in Parliament, it is the House of Commons passes tax bills. The problem that led to the revolution started when the British Parliament started levying what they would have called internal taxes from Parliament onto the colonies, bypassing that lower house of assembly. And that's what taxation without representation means. Didn't mean the colonists wanted a seat in Parliament. That's probably the last thing they wanted. What it meant was that revenue bills had to start in their lower house of assembly, and the Stamp Act bypassed that. The British tried to get around that with the Townshend duties. They tried to disguise an internal tax as an external tax by putting it on imports. The problem was that the revenues collected were to pay for government officials. Well, that kind of took away the check and balances the lower houses of assembly had on their royal governor, because the lower houses held the purse strings of the colony, and it was the only thing they could do to control the governors, the royal governors. So that kind of took that away. Same thing with the Tea Act. Yeah, it made the tax on tea was cheaper than what they were paying in England, but it gave a monopoly on tea to the East India Company, and the revenues were to go to administer the colony. That was the problem. It emasculated the lower house of assembly, and that's how the problem started. After the Tea Party, of course, we know the British imposed the Boston Port Bill, followed by the rest of the intolerable acts. And I think the one that's most important, the one most hideous, is the Massachusetts Government Act, which pretty much abrogated the royal charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, put the royal governor, or they named the royal governor as Lieutenant General Gage, who was also the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, pretty much putting the colony under martial law. And when he dissolves the lower house of assembly and forbids the town meetings, that's what really set off the Massachusetts Bay colonists. And that's when things started to turn. They said, okay, if that's the way we want to play, we'll form our own shadow government in Concord. And they start telling the town meetings, the local governments, to send the taxes not to Boston, not to the royal governor, but to Concord for the provincial Congress. And they establish an armed force. They gather the militia. They call it the Army of Observation. They start collecting arms and ammunition and equipment and things like that. They pass their own laws for a reorganization of the militia. They pass laws to form the Minutemen. And just in case there is a shooting war, what is the traditional role of the militia by the English tradition? It is to protect the populace against the central government using the regular army as a tool of oppression. That's the purpose of the militia. That was the purpose of the colonial militia under this provincial Congress. Of course, things are getting worse. More of the intolerable acts are passed, the Quartering Act, the Administration of Justice Act, which is eroding all the rights that Massachusetts Bay colonists see as their liberty or their right as free-born English subjects. And that's what sparks the rebellion. And they always look to the king as, you know, the king is not being served by his ministers very well. We get all these acts passed by Parliament that are really arbitrary. The king's ministers are not serving him well. If the king only knew what they were doing in his name, he would come to our rescue. And that's why when you look at primary source documents about Lexington and Concord, they don't call them the British Army. They don't call them His Majesty's Army. They call them the ministerial forces, because the Americans thought they were acting in the name of the king's ministers, not the king himself. In fact, there are some reports that some of the Massachusetts militia and minute companies, when they mustered on April 19th, mustered and yelled, "God save the king," as part of their muster. Not out of force of habit, but they saw the king as the good guy, not the bad guy in all this. It doesn't start to turn until later in the summer of 1775. And as we all know, the battles of Lexington and Concord are the first engagement of the American Revolutionary War. Exchange of musketry on the Common at Lexington. Bigger battle turns into a running gunfight from Concord all the way back to Boston, followed in June by the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although an American tactical loss, we can probably say it was a strategic victory for the impact it had on the morale. And at the same time, the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. Just a couple days before the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress establishes the Continental Army. They didn't know it in Boston yet. They still called it the Army of Observation, but it was essentially what would become the Continental Army at that time. And I think it's really important to remember that the resolution establishing the Continental Army says for the defense of American liberty in June of 1775, not independence, the defense of American liberty. So I think I'll end it there unless there's some questions.
Ryan, back to you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Glenn. Nice job. And we'll get started with our second speaker tonight. We'd like to welcome Mark R. Anderson. He is a retired U.S. Air Force officer, a Department of Air Force missile defense planner, and independent historian in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is the author of The Battle of the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, 1774 through 1776. He also has a forthcoming book, Down the Warpath to the Cedars, Indians' First Battles in the Revolution, which is due out May 2021. He is also an essay contributor in the 10 Key Campaigns, which these talks are based on, is this book here. Good job by Roger and company putting that together. And let's welcome Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us tonight. Pleasure to be able to talk to you all. I'm going to focus my talk on, sort of like Glenn did with Lexington and Bunker Hill, on the roots of the Canadian campaign. I'm going to look at how in a matter of 5 months did the colonies go from the local defensive actions at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill to invading Canada. The Canadian campaign is different from the war's other key campaigns in both its scope and audacity. It was offensive into a seemingly foreign colony hundreds of miles away that wasn't even represented in the Continental Congress. And to do that, we need to look before hostilities started. As the colonies were starting to come together in the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, they didn't focus on the military threat from the north, even though during the colonial wars, there had been regular eruptions of violence from the north, typically Canadian raids and Indian raids, but by the French and Indian War, including major armies coming from the north. The focus at Philadelphia that fall was on politics in Canada. Specifically, how could they get the Canadians to join the Continental Confederacy that was forming and demonstrate North American unity and resolve against the ministry and its, quote, oppressions. So amongst many letters and addresses that they wrote that fall, they specifically composed one for the inhabitants of Quebec because they considered them so important, they gave them their own address. And throughout the presentation, I'll interchangeably use Quebec and Canada as they were interchangeably used at the time. Technically, it was the province of Quebec that we'll be looking at in particular. So that Continental Congress address was a political primer for the Canadians on what were important British rights. They flattered the Canadians and said that they were certainly worthy of joining this North American cause. As they summed it up, Canada was, quote, the only link wanting to complete the bright and strong chain of union that was being established in North America. It's important to remember that Canada at the time of the Revolution is not really the continent-wide region that we think of today. The maritime provinces were separate colonies. So what we're really looking at is the settled portion of the former French colony of New France. Hopefully you can see the map I've thrown up there for everybody's reference. Population was 80 to 100,000 people, almost all of them being French Catholic rural farmers who lived on or within miles of the major riverways. There were two urban populations in Quebec in the northeast. That was the Atlantic Gateway, the province's avenue to reach the rest of the world. Montreal, 170 miles to the southwest, was the gateway to the interior of the continent, the native world. And it was a fur trade hub, and fur trade was the economic engine of the province at the time of the Revolution. So if we're looking at what had once been New France, how did it become part of the British Empire? Well, that is explained in the French and Indian War. After failed campaigns for years, in 1760, the British government concentrated their efforts, made a three-pronged offensive, and conquered New France. Those military gains were secured 3 years later with the Treaty of Paris, and now was part of the British Empire as the province of Quebec. That brought a small Anglo-Canadian element, still statistically insignificant in comparison to their French Catholic neighbors, but a good number of merchants and officials started to move into the province. Their government was under Governor Guy Carleton, who really focused on trying to secure the long-term dedication and loyalty of the French Catholic Canadians by tempering what had been traditional British Protestant imperial laws and customs. And he particularly focused his efforts on the French Canadian noble elite and the Catholic Church. A quick look at the geography. The St. Lawrence was the defining feature of the province. And as I mentioned before, it's gateway to the rest of the world. It's still pretty remote though. The distance from Boston to Quebec City by water, sea and river miles, is 1,000 miles. And on top of that, the St. Lawrence was frozen from the end of November to the end of April every year, splitting the province of Quebec from the other 13 colonies were the Appalachian Highlands. So there was really effectively only one line of communication, particularly during the winter, that connected them, and that was the Hudson River, Lake Champlain, Richelieu River corridor. To give you a reference to the scale of the theater there, this is roughly 400 miles from Albany to Quebec City, and that's the same distance that Washington would cover towards the end of the war as he took his army from New York City to Yorktown. Now that we've got a quick look at the initial politics, the geography, people, and situation, as we go into 1775, we'll look at how things changed rapidly after Lexington and Concord. Many of you are probably familiar that after Lexington and Concord, the next major military event was the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. And this wasn't organized by the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress hadn't yet reconvened. It was organized independently in two different missions by Connecticut and Massachusetts, who both saw the importance of these forts at the south end of Lake Champlain to secure the Lake Champlain corridor and defend the northern frontier. So Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys ended up forming most of the Connecticut expedition. The Massachusetts expedition was just Benedict Arnold. His men were still being organized. But together, they took Fort Ticonderoga on the 10th of May and Crown Point on the 11th of May, the next day, securing those key points on the northern frontier. But there was probably a more important event that occurred just a week later. Benedict Arnold had been charged not only with taking Fort Ticonderoga, but also with capturing a British sloop of war that operated on Lake Champlain. Yes. So he gathered 50 men, captured Loyalist sloop and some boats and sailed north. And on the 18th of May, they surprised a small garrison at British Fort St. John's, which was the station of this sloop, just across the Canadian border, took 11 prisoners of war, took the sloop, boats, supplies, and headed back south. This was tremendously important because in order for Governor Carleton and any forces in Canada to threaten the colonies from the north, they really needed to contest naval superiority, which Benedict Arnold had just secured. But this action also became the first rebel military incursion into Canada, and Governor Carleton reacted quickly to it. He had limited resources at hand. There were only 2 regular redcoat regiments in the province, so he concentrated them on at the border at Fort St. John's, and turned what had been a dilapidated outpost into a respectable defensive fortification that could block the Richelieu River and the path into the rest of Canada. He also tried to mobilize Canadian efforts. On the 9th of June, 1775, he declared martial law and tried to reestablish the militia that had been disestablished shortly after the British conquest. It was underwhelming response. The only people who eagerly joined were the sons of the French Canadian nobles, who maybe 60 to 100 of them at any time were serving alongside the British soldiers at Fort St. John's. Otherwise, the response was indifferent. The Canadians were not particularly interested in fighting a people who hadn't offended them yet. So Carleton didn't have much to expect from them, but he did turn to a third group of people in Canada. Those were the Seven Nations Indians. The Seven Nations was a confederacy of Catholic mission villages that had been established under the French regime that were separate from the more commonly known Six Nations Iroquois in Western New York. The Seven Nations considered themselves independent, even though they typically had allied with the French. And the war was developing too quickly for them to really have figured out what their commitments were going to be. So they hesitated every time Governor Carleton tried to pressure them into joining the king's side. But their loose form of government allowed individual warriors to do as they wished. So there were a few score Indian warriors alongside the Redcoats at Fort St. John's by the time of the invasion. As Glenn mentioned, the Continental Congress had also established the Continental Army at this time, and in doing that, they created a Northern Department, which facilitated a separate army in the North, which would be commanded by a Major General, Philip Schuyler, a New Yorker. As he headed north to take command of that army, intelligence continued to flow into Philadelphia that would be particularly relevant in driving the Canadian campaign. Politically, it became clear that the Canadians, even if many of them favored the American cause, were not willing or able to actually join and send delegates to the Continental Congress until they were no longer under British government control. Militarily, they had a pretty accurate assessment that there were only 2 regiments to protect the entire colony, and that the Canadians were largely unwilling to fight on the king's side at this point. But the Indians were a very critical element that summer. Figuring out what the Seven Nations' intentions really were was confusing, and contradictory reports came on almost a daily basis. At the end of June, a particularly alarming report came, seemed very credible at the time, that said that the Seven Nations had taken up the hatchet and were ready to embark on the warpath with Governor Carleton, seemed to forebode an imminent invasion. So the Continental Congress on the 27th of June authorized General Schuyler to invade Canada. His main objective was the peace and security of the colonies, but they added a key caveat to his orders that he should only undertake any military actions if they would not be disagreeable to the Canadians. The ministry was the enemy, not the Canadians. General Schuyler had an able deputy in Richard Montgomery, also a New Yorker, and they both headed to Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point to organize an invasion force. It took them weeks, however, to gather the necessary supplies, men, and boats that they would need to go north on Lake Champlain and into Canada. So in the meantime, they continued to receive encouragement from people within Canada. There were Canadian patriots that set up a correspondence with the forts, and friendly Seven Nations Indians even came and visited, both of them encouraging the possibility of an invasion and even promising support on some occasions. But the critical moment that launched the invasion came at the end of August. Schuyler and Montgomery had assembled a substantial force, but they were still hesitant to go north. And General Schuyler got called away to Albany for an important conference with the Six Nations Indians at exactly the time that the key piece of intelligence came that would drive the invasion. And that was that over the summer, the British had built 2 new ships at Fort St. John's, and they were ready to be launched at any moment. If they reached Lake Champlain, all bets would be off as far as the defensive strength of the northern colonies. So Montgomery took what he had, the men that were most ready, launched them on ships and boats, and started sailing north. Schuyler, as soon as he received word, rushed north and joined them just before they crossed the province line and into Canada on the 5th of September. I'm just going to talk about the first action that was undertaken as they reached Canada, and I think that's particularly telling, in that General Schuyler sat down to write a message to the Canadians, a political manifesto explaining why the Army was entering Canada. And that was not to impinge or infringe on the Canadians and Indians' independence or rights, but to drive out the ministerial forces and the government so that they'd be free to act on their own. So that's the situation on the main line of communications on the Richelieu. As you all probably know, there's one more important key leader in the Canadian campaign, and that's Benedict Arnold. We last left him at Crown Point. He stayed there after capturing that British sloop for a short while, but soon got embroiled in a command dispute over who should be in charge at the fort, and he left. He ended up in Cambridge with the main army, talking with George Washington, who gained confidence in Arnold and gave him command of a new expedition to go up the Kennebec River in what is now Maine, over the Appalachian Highlands, and down the Chaudière River to descend upon, let me see if I can change slides here. Just a second. Descend on Quebec City and hopefully take it by surprise. Even if he didn't take it by surprise, the hope was that he would force Governor Carleton to split his forces between north and south, and being already weak, it would put him in an untenable military situation. Yeah, it looks like I've lost my control of my Zoom here, so I will wrap it up. What we see in October 1774 to September 1775, when the invasion began, is that there were really 2 reasons why the Continental colonies turned north. They were to politically bring the Canadians into the Confederation and militarily defend the colonies by preempting what they expected would be an invasion from the north that would enable the Canadians then to join their confederation in opposition to the ministry. And that's really the conclusion of the road to the campaign. What ended up happening was they were not properly resourced or planned for the long term of an invasion of such a scope. So despite promising victories in the fall of 1775, the campaign quickly deteriorated in the summer or in the winter and spring of 1776 to the point where it completely collapsed, and there was a withdrawal all the way back to the forts at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. So before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, the Canadian campaign was over. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Mark. All right, before we get into the question and answer, I'd just like to remind everybody to send all your questions through the chat. Roger will get the questions and he'll forward them to me. We do have a couple questions. We can start here for Glenn. Glenn, your chapter in the book was kind of the beginning of the war, Lexington and Concord and all that. And you always hear like the term Minutemen and militia. Can you kind of explain the difference between those?
Yes, those are 2 separate things. Well, kind of. One of my pet peeves is people say, well, my great whatever joined the militia. Well, in colonial and early Republic America, you didn't join the militia. When you turned 18, you were in the militia. Every able-bodied white male citizen. And they were required to perform military drill on occasion. They were organized regionally, usually by the counties. The counties had their regiments and their officers. As the revolution, or what we now call the revolution, is approaching, it was obvious they needed something else, something more politically reliable, something that trained more often, was more professional, and they came up with the Minutemen. The Minutemen were select militia. About 1/4 of the militia, its officers were more politically reliable Whigs than those in the standard militia. There were still some loyalist officers in the common militia, is what it was called. The men were usually younger, preferably unmarried, more active. They trained more often, usually 4 times a week. And what a lot of people don't realize is they were paid. They were paid at the same rate as British regulars, per diem rate for the 4 days they trained, so that their civilian pursuits, if they had to leave them, did not leave them without any income. And also the minute companies and battalions, as opposed to the militia, were automatically under the authority of the executive of the provincial Congress, called the Committee of Safety, and they could go anywhere in the colony, whereas the militia were usually restricted to their counties unless they were called out by a higher authority. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. I think it does. All right, our next audience question here is from Robert Wong, and he asks, why did the French-Canadian population not side with the Americans, since the French were bitter enemies of the British? So that's probably for you, Mark.
Okay, actually, the historiography generally tends to show that the French Canadians didn't support the invasion. I contest that to some degree and see that really the response in Canada was a lot like it was in many of the other colonies. There was a huge portion of the population that really just wanted to go on living its life. They may take advantage of whoever was there ready to buy supplies, but they weren't really eager to commit to either side of this conflict. Despite the fact that they were French and Catholic and then being, quote, invaded by these English Protestants, there were many Canadians that actually took sides. There was a huge group of the French Canadian population in the Richelieu Valley, hundreds of them that took up arms to join the invaders and really were key to helping success in the capture of Fort St. John's in Montreal that fall. And over the course of the campaign, there would actually be 2 Canadian Continental regiments that were formed. They were never fully manned, but they were a demonstration that there were Canadians willing to fight for the cause. And I think a particularly critical moment came in after General Montgomery's failed attempt to take Quebec City on New Year's Eve, 1775, when Benedict Arnold tried to consolidate forces around Quebec City to keep a blockade there. And there were hundreds of French Canadians who, even though the attack on Quebec City had failed, came and helped man the lines. I think it's a stereotype that the Canadians were either loyalists or indifferent. There were definitely some strong elements in both French Canadian and Anglo-Canadian populations, but there was a pretty sizable element that was on the Patriot side as well. So I think we need to take a more balanced look at that question, that answer to that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We have another audience question, and this is actually for both speakers. Can you both speak about the role of diseases in both the Siege of Boston and the Quebec campaign? So I guess we could start with Glenn, and then Mark, you can answer the question when he's done.
Well, until I think it was the Franco-Prussian War, traditionally more soldiers died from disease than died from combat. And this is no exception in the Revolutionary War. One of the complications of the Siege of Boston, that military operation that followed Lexington and Concord, was that there was an outbreak of smallpox in Boston. And Washington was always weighing the advantages and disadvantages of storming Boston. And one of the things that kept him from doing it was an outbreak of smallpox. And even when the British evacuated, he had to find soldiers that had already been inoculated or had already survived smallpox to be the first troops into Boston, just in case there was any residual potential that they would contract smallpox on entering the city. So it remained, that's why the Continental Army established its smallpox inoculation camp at Fishkill and so forth, was to prevent things like that.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, the disease was a very important factor in the Canadian campaign. In the early parts, the invading army on the Richelieu corridor outside Fort St. John's were basically living in swamps. So there were hundreds of men that were being felled by what might generically be called the camp disease, dysentery, and other fevers. Once they got out of that area, the army that remained to continue the campaign pressed on up to Quebec City, where they were met face-to-face by smallpox. Started breaking out in December, within perhaps a week after they arrived outside Quebec City, and just continued to grow, despite the fact that General Montgomery established a smallpox hospital. Soldiers tried to inoculate themselves against orders, and inoculation is different from vaccination in that you actually have to suffer through the disease. You just get a less virulent strain in most cases. So there were, and by doing it secretly, they didn't necessarily take the proper precautions to prevent spreading it amongst other soldiers. So there were huge portions of the army that were out of commission on sick rolls from smallpox outside Quebec City for the rest of the campaign. And by my best estimate, it's a very rough estimate given the lack of good rolls, but up to 1,000 soldiers may have died in the Canadian campaign just from disease.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mark. I always find that question interesting. I had an ancestor that was inoculated at Valley Forge in '78, the spring of '78. So thank you both. All right, this question is for Glenn. Can you talk a bit about the makeup of the troops at Bunker Hill and how that was different from Lexington Concord? Were there troops from other colonies at Bunker Hill? So can you just kind of explain the makeup of the troops that were there, please?
Sure. When the alarms went out on the 19th of April, what mustered were companies and battalions and eventually regiments of militia and Minutemen. Once the initial engagement was over, then the provincial Congress needed to organize its army of observation. And these are different in militia, although that the men came from the militia, they signed on to do what we today would call active duty until the end of the year. So they were full-time soldiers, although drawn from the militia. And the Army of Observation is more precisely called the New England Army of Observation because troops, volunteers, militia units, activated units, whatever, from the other New England colonies came to join. So on Bunker Hill, you not only had men from Massachusetts, but also Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and so forth that were involved. And I would say most, if not all of them, were these what would later be in the British Army be called provincial regulars. And in fact, it's kind of one of those confusing things about the terminology. The Americans at this point of the war are called provincials. Of course, later the loyalists who became regulars in the Crown service would be called provincials. But they were, like I said, they were full-time soldiers serving till the end of the year, drawn from the militia, but in a full-time status. That's what made them different. And as I mentioned before, on June 14, 1775, Congress resolved to form the Continental Army. And when Washington gets to Cambridge in July, these would be the first units of the Continental Army, although it'd take a while to whip them into the shape that we are more familiar with from the later campaigns.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. All right, our next question is actually to both of you again. Can you both talk a bit about the makeup of the British forces at both around Boston versus the regiments at Quebec? And can you discuss the British Army in general? Were they all British? Were they from, were they from other parts of Europe, other countries, etc.? So I guess, Glenn, you can go ahead, start first, just keep it chronologically, and then Mark. Thank you.
Okay, well, at the time of Lexington and Concord, Boston was an occupied city. It had had 4 regiments of regulars there since the Townsend duty crisis earlier. But by the time of April 1775, that force had grown. It included 12 regiments of foot, battalion of artillery, a battalion of Marines, and of course there was a naval squadron from the North American station. Typically, this is the period that the British Army was there. They had reintroduced the light infantry companies into the regiments of foot. So out of the 10 companies of a standard regiment of foot, you had 2 flank companies, the Grenadier Company and the Light Infantry Company. And these would be the core of what marches to Lexington and Concord on the 19th of April. 10 light infantry companies, 10 grenadier companies from 10 different regiments of foot, placed under the command of the senior lieutenant colonel, Smith, I think of the 10th Regiment, if I'm not mistaken. They also took 1 company of the 1st Battalion of British Marines, and the second in command of the expedition is Major Pitcairn, who was the senior major Army or Marine in Boston at the time, and that's what composed the expedition. In addition to that, before the march started, it was planned as an exercise to get the soldiers some exercise, a show of strength, in addition to seizing the arms and ammunition that were stored at Concord. Gage sent out a patrol of 10 officers and 10 sergeants, all mounted, but they were infantrymen, to kind of watch the roads for the express riders like Dawes and Revere and things like that, to provide either stop them from spreading the alarm or possibly capturing some of the Patriot leaders that were out and about at the time. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Glenn. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, the actual composition of the soldiers within the British regiments isn't really my area of expertise, but the units that were in defending Canada during the Quebec campaign were English traditional regiments, and they had been in Canada for a number of years. After the French and Indian War, the British started with a policy to rotate units on a fairly regular basis, and that started costing money. So they slowed the replacement of units so that the 2 regiments, the 7th and the 26th regiments of foot that were in Canada at the time had been there for many years. What that meant was they were very familiar with garrison duty, they were familiar with the area, and they moved around within Canada, so familiar with the locals. But what they didn't really get much opportunity to do was work together on tactics and operational maneuver over those many years that they'd been in Canada. Still very professional soldiers, but maybe not the super disciplined lines of troops that we might picture in your standard British depiction of soldiers in the Revolution.
I'd like to add something, Brian.
Go right ahead, yeah.
We call them British regulars, but they were drawn from several other countries of the British Isles. The British Army had a couple what they called establishments. The British establishment was in the home island. They had the Irish establishment, so there would have been a lot of Irish recruits among them. And when the units would deploy to North America, if they weren't to full strength, they would draft them out of other regiments. So you might find Welshmen and Englishmen and Irishmen in the same regiment. And just kind of following on too, we talk a lot about the most disciplined army in the world. Well, maybe not so much. Most of them had been in the army less than 2 or 3 years. They weren't full-time professionals. There are very few veterans from the French and Indian War still left. A lot of them, like I said, were fairly new recruits. I would wager that some of the militia and Minuteman Company soldiers probably had more combat experience than a lot of the British regulars did. As I mentioned before, they had just reintroduced the light infantry companies. They were still getting used to those new tactics and techniques that were reintroduced to the Army after being absent since the end of the French and Indian War and so forth. So even though they were considered regulars and the militia were considered citizen soldiers, I would say they were probably fairly close to equal in their efficiency.
Okay, great. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you both. All right, here's, I guess, a toss-up question for either one of you, if you know the answer. It says, I have heard that, sorry. Okay, it says, I have heard that John Andre's remains were exchanged sometime in 1821, maybe, for the remains of Richard Montgomery. I think his remains were 1818 was the dates that this person states. Is this true? So did they exchange the remains between those two?
I'll start off
Yep.
in that I don't know the details of that. I know Richard Montgomery was interred in Quebec City for a long time, and then before his wife Janet died, they had managed to secure the return of his remains, and there was considerable celebration or commemoration as his remains were brought back into the United States at that point. But I'm not familiar with any specific exchange of remains that was involved with that.
I never heard of that myself, although not to say it's not. But it'd be interesting to find out if that's true or not. Okay, this next, Glenn, are you there? This next
I'm
question.
here. Yeah.
Okay, did you hear that question, Glenn?
I did. I don't have anything to add except that there are many counties and towns named after Montgomery in the United States.
Yeah, I live in one of them, Montgomery County, New York. So I'm sitting in one of those right now. Okay, good. All right, Glenn, this is a question for you. How did the events at Lexington and Bunker Hill affect the British strategy for the rest of the war?
Well, a lot of, well, first of all, Lexington and Concord, running gunfight. This falls into what the American soldiers who had served in the Crown forces during the French and Indian War had learned bushfighting or skirmishing, and that type of battle was right up their alley. Unfortunately, not too many of the rest of the battles in the war are fought like that, although it did give them some combat experience and a good bloodying. Bunker Hill, I think the most telling example, or the most valuable lesson the Americans learned is that they could stand against British regulars, that you could fight against an enemy attacking in linear formations from behind breastworks. Wasn't the first time it happened. It happened in previous conflicts as well, but I think this really brought it home to the Americans. They learned an awful lot about logistics because they started running out of ammunition toward the end of the fight. They learned a lot about employment of artillery. The American artillery was useless almost on Bunker Hill because where it was positioned. On the British side, they learned a valuable lesson in attacking a determined enemy behind earthen fortifications, obviously. Some people say that it affected Howe for the rest of his career in North America as never wanting to repeat a frontal attack against an entrenched enemy again. So you see at the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776, he halts his attack on Brooklyn Heights after the Battle of Long Island just for that reason. He decides to execute a siege. You see Cornwallis doing the same thing at Assunpink Creek, sometimes called the Second Battle of Trenton, the night before Princeton, halting the battle as not only as the sun goes down, but having to cross a river obstacle perpendicular to the axis of advance against an entrenched enemy. They decide to execute, either find a way around, there's always an assailable flank, either find a way around an assailable flank or settle in for a siege. So I think it affected how the British tactical doctrine for most of the rest of the war. They would not repeat the frontal attack against an enemy behind strong entrenchments again.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. All right, these next two questions are for you, Mark. The first one is, did the Oneida Indians fight for the British during the American invasion in 1775?
That's a good question. The Six Nations Indians, the Iroquois, of which the Oneida were one, were proved to be an important factor in that campaign, particularly as 1776 rolled around. I have not seen any evidence that the Oneidas participated on the British side in 1775, but they did play an important role diplomatically that supported the American side in 1775, in that they were inclined to remain neutral while other parts of the Six Nations kind of leaned towards the British. And so the Oneidas took an active role in encouraging neutrality, not just in the Six Nations, but in the Seven Nations as well. And so after General Schuyler and the other Continental Commissioners at Albany secured a neutrality with the Six Nations just before the invasion, the Oneidas volunteered to send a delegation north to Canada, to the Seven Nations, to share the news of the Six Nations neutrality. And in my forthcoming book that will be out in May, you'll see that this is a key point in the 1775 invasion. The Oneidas actually helped keep the Seven Nations from becoming more deeply embroiled in the contest and actually get them to step aside and let the British and Americans fight it out. There is perhaps some evidence that a handful of Oneidas might have joined the campaign in 1776 with other Six Nations warriors that came eventually to drive the Americans out. But it's pretty limited evidence as far as that goes.
Is it okay if I add something, Brian?
No, go right ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, this gets into my previous book, Year of the Hangman, which is actually about the war on the frontier between 77 and 79. Carleton was reluctant to unleash the King's Indian allies, even if he could get them to do that. He didn't think they would take the time to distinguish between Whigs or Tories. And it's not until 1777 when John Butler is given the instruction to support Burgoyne's invasion by mustering the King's Indian allies. And as we know, at the Battle of Oriskany, out of the Six Nations, 4 of them would side with the British. And at Oriskany, primarily the Mohawks and the Senecas are fighting on the side of the British, whereas the Oneidas are fighting on the side of the Patriots. And we talk a lot about the American Revolution becoming a civil war between American different political leanings, but it was also, it tore the Six Nations apart. Because prior to that, the individual Six Nations were allowed to make treaties or alliances with other European powers. They had a standing agreement that on the battlefield they would not fight each other if they happened to be on the same battlefield on different sides. That changes at Oriskany, where you have Oneidas fighting Senecas and Mohawks. So that pretty much, like I said, drowns out the council fire at Onondaga, and the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras side more with the Americans, and the Cayugas, Senecas, Mohawks, and Onondagas. Cayugas side more with the British.
Yep. A good point, Glenn. All right, Mark, back to you. What did the soldiers think of Benedict Arnold?
That is a challenging question, to say the least. They were inspired, for sure, enough to get them through their wilderness journey and onto the other side and into Canada. But once I got into Canada, particularly among his New England troops, there was an element that did not appreciate Arnold and his leadership style. And they threatened to walk off at a couple key points, particularly before General Montgomery intervened and kind of calmed their passions. At one point before the attack on Quebec City, they even tried to get a different commander appointed over them. And again, Montgomery kind of short-circuited that. Once the attack on Quebec City was done, there's still this element that doesn't like Arnold. And there's a few key leaders that distinctly do not like him, and they will continue to play out over the next couple of years as his enemies on the same side. But Arnold had the ability to rally the troops when necessary, but he sure did make a lot of them unhappy in between those critical fires that he had to put out. So that's sort of the Arnold in a nutshell in the Canadian campaign.
Yeah, I believe Colonel John Brown from the Berkshires area is one of those guys who was against Arnold, which he ended up being killed at the Battle of Stone Arabia, in the Mohawk Valley in 1780. Okay, yeah, excellent, Mark. Another question for you, Mark, is do we know how long Daniel Morgan was held as prisoner in Quebec? And also, what was the experience like? And what type of relationship did he have with Arnold afterwards? And why?
So when the attack on Quebec City failed, I don't remember the exact number, but 300 some soldiers that had been in Arnold's expedition were captured and taken into captivity in Quebec City. They were put in what used to be essentially a monastery. The officers were given a little bit more freedom until there was an indication that there were plans to escape, and then things clamped down. It was cold, not a whole lot of food. Smallpox was spreading. But especially by the time spring came around and the pressure was no longer in Quebec City, they were given a little bit more tolerable conditions in captivity. And they would remain in captivity. I don't remember specifically when Morgan was returned, but in the summer of 1776, after the invasion was done, most of the prisoners that had been taken were loaded up on ships and sent to New York to eventually be returned, either through exchanges that would eventually be worked out, paroled and then exchanged. And I don't remember any particular specifics about Morgan's relationship with Arnold from there.
So I'm going to take it from here. I think we've had an overview, certainly of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill and Quebec. It is certainly just an overview. The book from which both Glenn's essays and Mark's essays here is the 10 campaigns of the 10 key campaigns of the American Revolution. This particular book has an overview from 10 of some of the best writers about the American Revolution. But the other thing that this book has at the end of every chapter is a list of other books that are available for these 10 key campaigns. Certainly Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, and Quebec really got the war going. Remember that in this first year of war, it really wasn't clear as to whether or not the colonists really wanted to break away from the mother country. The Declaration of Independence didn't come until July the next year, obviously. But 1775 was really when it turned into a fighting war, and certainly there were a lot of momentous occurrences. So tonight, I am glad that we were able to actually launch the war. If you go back a couple of weeks, we also have an episode on the past episodes. If you go to the past episodes tab of American Author History Talk, historyauthortalks.com, you'll see a show that we had a few weeks ago with Todd Brasted, who talked about the New York campaign, and Larry Kidder, who talked about the 10 Crucial Days campaign and Princeton during the American Revolution. So there's a lot of other episodes on historyauthortalks.com, the past episodes. So once again, I invite you to take a look at our upcoming episodes. We do have an episode coming up on the Battle of Monmouth. We have episodes that are going to feature the Southern campaigns as well. And this isn't all about the American Revolution, although I do focus a lot on the American Revolution. I've got some other episodes coming up on Civil War and World War II and other times in American history. So I would like to thank Mark Anderson and Glenn Williams for their talks tonight. Thanks to Brian Mack of the Fort Plain Museum and for his stewardship of the show. And if you have any other questions, you can go to historyauthortalks.com and you can reach me at the on the comments page or the contact page. So once again, I thank you all for coming, and stay healthy, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Roger.
Yep. Thank you, Roger.
You bet.
Good evening, everybody.
So long, everyone.